Get out. You don't belong here anymore. That's right. Leave. The second the husband and his mistress forced the wife and his elderly mother out into the storm.
Welcome to my channel where every episode reveals secrets, power, and unforgettable revenge.
They believed the story was over. In their minds, Dorothy had already lost. No powerful position, no wealthy family, no courtroom army waiting to defend her. And Eleanor, a retired widow with a cane and fading health. No influence, no leverage, no threat. So they stood there in the freezing rain while the iron gate locked behind them with a sharp metallic click that sounded disturbingly permanent. The curtains inside the mansion closed one by one, as if the house itself was erasing them, replacing them, forgetting them. Inside that warm house stood Vanessa Holt, calm, patient, victorious. A woman who hadn't stolen a marriage overnight. No, she had dismantled it carefully, piece by piece, over more than a year. Every lie calculated, every manipulation deliberate, every weakness in Richard Callahan expertly exploited until there was almost nothing left of the man Dorothy once loved. But Richard had overlooked one thing, one dangerous detail that would soon destroy everything he had sacrificed his soul to build. 3 weeks earlier, at exactly 11:47 p.m., Dorothy had been driving home alone on an isolated highway when her headlights caught something barely visible near the guardrail. A man, collapsed, bleeding, barely breathing, his phone shattered beside him, his pulse weak, rain pouring over him while cars rushed past without stopping. Most people would have slowed down, stared for a second, then driven away. Dorothy didn't. She slammed on the brakes. She ran into the darkness, screaming for help that never came. She tore off her scarf and wrapped it tightly around the stranger's leg to stop the bleeding. She stayed on her knees beside him for 43 terrifying minutes, talking to him, keeping him conscious, refusing to let him die before the ambulance arrived. She never asked his name. She never waited for praise. She simply saved a stranger, then disappeared back into her ordinary life. What Dorothy never discovered was that the dying man on that highway was Gerald Harmon, one of the most feared billionaires in the country. A man whose signature alone could create or destroy empires overnight. And at this exact moment, Gerald Harmon was preparing to approve a $3.5 billion corporate contract. A contract Richard Callahan had betrayed his marriage, abandoned his mother, and sacrificed every shred of decency to obtain. Then the impossible happened. A long black limousine slowly entered the rain-soaked street. Not toward Richard's office, not toward the mansion gates. It stopped directly in front of the two women abandoned on the sidewalk. The rear door opened, and when Gerald Harmon himself stepped out into the storm, Richard saw everything from the upstairs window. What happened next would shatter every assumption in that house. Because sometimes one act of kindness travels farther than money, farther than power, farther than betrayal itself. And sometimes the person you destroy today becomes the reason your entire world collapses tomorrow. Dear viewers, this story proves something most people learn too late. The way you treat people during their weakest moments reveals the future waiting for you. Kindness never disappears. Even when nobody sees it, it is working quietly in places you cannot imagine. Stay until the end, because the final twist changes everything. And tell us in the comments, if you were Dorothy, what would you have done differently that night? If stories like this move you, subscribe now. More unforgettable stories are coming. Stories that will completely change the way you look at loyalty, betrayal, and destiny. The rain had started softly. The kind of rain that sounds harmless at first, until suddenly it isn't. By the time Dorothy Callahan dragged her second suitcase across the marble porch, the storm had turned violent. Rain hammered the pavement in furious waves, exploding against the concrete as if the sky itself was outraged by what was happening inside that house. Dorothy didn't rush. She stood frozen at the top of the steps, one hand gripping the suitcase handle so tightly her knuckles turned white, the other pressed against her chest as she forced herself to breathe. Because right now, breathing was the only thing she still had control over. Behind her, the front door closed quietly. Not slammed, not emotional, Just closed. Cold. Final. Deliberate. The kind of closing that says there is no coming back. And maybe that hurt more than screaming would have. Dorothy had been married to Richard Callahan for 9 years, 3 months, and 11 days. But tonight, her husband had looked at her with a calmness so chilling it barely felt human. He told her the house belonged to him now. The accounts belonged to him. The future belonged to him. And she should leave before the lawyers became involved. That was it. 9 years reduced to a business transaction. Standing beside him was Vanessa Holt, leaning casually against the kitchen doorway wearing a silk robe Dorothy had never seen before, which meant Richard had bought it for another woman while still sleeping beside his wife every night. Vanessa didn't smile. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was cruel enough. Dorothy never screamed, never begged, never gave either of them the satisfaction. She simply stared at Richard one last time, long enough to memorize the face of the man she would never truly know again. Then she picked up her bags and walked away. But the deepest shock came moments later, because Richard hadn't only thrown out his wife. He had thrown out his own mother too. Eleanor Callahan was 67 years old. Ever since her hip surgery 18 months earlier, she relied on a cane to walk. After Richard's father died, she moved into the east wing of the estate, and over time, she had become closer to Dorothy than to her own son. She sat beside Dorothy during lonely nights while Richard worked late. She defended her during arguments Richard always pretended to win. She taught her old family recipes and quietly treated her like the daughter she never had. Vanessa hated that bond, so Eleanor became part of the removal. The East Wing will be converted into a private office, Richard had explained coldly. Her presence no longer fits the new dynamic. The new dynamic, as if his mother were some outdated piece of furniture. Eleanor said nothing after hearing it, but Dorothy noticed the tightening in her jaw, the silent kind of pain too deep for words. Then Eleanor reached for Dorothy's arm, and together, the two women walked out into the storm. Now they stood outside the locked gates with 2 soaked suitcases between them, while the streetlight above flickered nervously, like even it was uncomfortable witnessing this betrayal. "He'll come back out," Eleanor whispered. But even she didn't sound convinced. "He won't," Dorothy answered quietly. No anger, no tears, just acceptance. And yet one memory kept clawing its way back into Dorothy's mind through the cold, exhaustion, and heartbreak. That highway, that broken silver car, that stranger gasping for air beside the road. She remembered kneeling on the wet asphalt, pressing trembling fingers against his chest just to make sure his heart was still beating. She remembered holding his hand while rain poured over both of them. She remembered promising a dying man he was not alone. And when she finally returned home that night, soaked to the bone and emotionally shattered, Richard barely glanced up from his phone long enough to notice. But somewhere across the city, inside a penthouse office high above the storm, a man who remembered every detail of that night was already making a decision. Gerald Harmon sat alone on the 44th floor of Harmon International Tower, staring through walls of glass at the rain sliding down the skyline in silver streaks. 3 open files rested across his enormous desk. 3 candidates. 3 companies competing for the largest contract of the year. One of them belonged to Richard Callahan. But Gerald's attention wasn't on the paperwork anymore. It was on the woman who had saved his life and the horrifying thing that had just been done to her. Gerald Harmon was 61 years old and worth an estimated $2 billion. For more than 3 decades, he had ruled Harmon Global Enterprises, a private infrastructure empire so powerful that entire cities changed when his company entered a market. In 32 years, Harmon Global had approved only 4 contracts worth over $1 billion. The 5th contract sat on Gerald's desk tonight. Value, $3. $5 billion. And the companies competing for it had spent years reshaping themselves just for the chance to win. Executives sacrificed families. Partnerships collapsed. Careers were destroyed behind polished conference room doors where everyone smiled while quietly bleeding each other dry. Richard Callahan's firm was one of those finalists. And until tonight, Richard believed he had already won. But Gerald Harmon had never trusted numbers alone. Financial statements could be manipulated. Presentations could be rehearsed. Entire reputations could be manufactured by expensive publicists and carefully scripted interviews. None of that impressed him anymore. Because 6 weeks ago, Gerald Harmon almost died alone on a dark highway. And in that moment, stripped of status, stripped of power, stripped of the illusion that money protects anyone from mortality, he learned something terrifyingly simple. Character is the only currency that never crashes. What a person does when nobody is watching, that is who they truly are. Not when cameras are present. Not when praise is guaranteed. Not when kindness is profitable. But at midnight, in the rain, on an empty road, when stopping brings risk instead of reward. Gerald slowly opened the left drawer of his desk and removed the one object he had looked at every single day since the accident. A photograph. Not a glamorous one. Not staged. Not important to anyone else. The image was grainy, time-stamped 11:52 p.m., taken from a county traffic surveillance camera during the police investigation. It showed the wrecked silver vehicle tilted near the guardrail. And beside it, kneeling on soaked asphalt, was a woman. Dorothy. Her back faced the camera. One hand pressed desperately against a dying man's chest while the other gripped his hand tightly, refusing to let him slip away. Even through the blurry footage, Gerald could see it. Urgency, compassion, determination. The unmistakable posture of someone who had made a decision deep in her soul. This stranger will not die tonight. Gerald stared at the photograph silently. His security division had identified her within 72 hours. His private investigators uncovered the rest within days. Dorothy Callahan, married 9 years, financially trapped inside a carefully controlled marriage disguised as luxury. A husband slowly replacing love with ownership. A mistress named Vanessa Holt who had been operating in the shadows for 14 months. And a husband currently competing for the largest contract of his career while secretly dismantling his entire family behind closed doors. Gerald knew everything. He knew Richard had submitted the proposal 8 months earlier, back when his life still looked respectable from the outside. Back before greed fully rotted whatever conscience he once possessed. But Gerald had waited, because timing mattered. Justice delivered too early becomes spectacle. And Gerald Harmon hated spectacle. He picked up his phone and made one call. "Where are they now?" he asked calmly. No greeting, no explanation. On the other end, his head of security, Marcus Doyle, answered immediately. "Outside the residence, sir. Still in the rain." Something dark flickered behind Gerald's eyes. He closed them for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood. "Bring the car around," he said quietly that I'll be downstairs in 10 minutes. The call ended. Gerald buttoned his jacket slowly and looked down at the photograph again. At the woman who stopped when everyone else kept driving. The woman who stayed beside a dying stranger in the cold with no expectation of reward. And for the first time in decades, something crossed Gerald Harmon's face that none of his executives had ever witnessed during a board meeting. Not anger, not calculation. Certainty, the terrifying kind. The kind that changes lives. He placed the photograph face down on the desk, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the elevator. The limousine was already waiting below. Outside the mansion, Dorothy had stopped counting time, stopped counting sacrifices, stopped counting disappointments. There was no point anymore. She had spent years waking early, sacrificing quietly, shrinking pieces of herself just to make a marriage feel stable for a man who had apparently abandoned it long ago. Eventually, exhaustion reaches a point where pain becomes numbness, and numbness becomes survival. Beside her, Eleanor sat carefully on one of the suitcases, gripping her cane tightly while rainwater soaked through her silver hair and ran down her face. She hadn't complained once. Not once. But Dorothy noticed Eleanor's pale knuckles wrapped around the cane handle so tightly they trembled. Not because she needed balance, because she needed something to hold onto before she completely broke apart in public. "Come on," Dorothy said softly, removing her coat and placing it over Eleanor's shoulders. "We'll call a cab. Patricia will let us stay tonight." Patricia lives almost 40 minutes away, Eleanor replied quietly. Then we'll be warm in 40 minutes. But Eleanor wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes had shifted further down the street. Her grip loosened slightly, and Dorothy recognized that expression instantly. The look people get when reality suddenly stops making sense. Dorothy turned slowly. Then she saw it. The limousine moved through the storm with unnatural smoothness. Expensive machines always seem to ignore bad weather, as though the world itself adjusted around wealth. Long black, silent, its headlights sliced through the rain like two blades of light as it rolled directly toward them. Not toward the mansion, toward them. The vehicle didn't hesitate, didn't slow uncertainly. It moved with absolute purpose, then stopped directly in front of Dorothy and Eleanor with such precision it felt less like coincidence and more like destiny arriving exactly on time. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Rain hammered the pavement. The engine purred softly. Even a flickering streetlight above steadied itself, as if the universe wanted this moment seen clearly. Then the rear door opened. Gerald Harmon stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. No visible bodyguards. No dramatic entrance. No performance. He didn't need one. Power radiated from him naturally. The quiet kind built over decades by men who no longer need to prove they are powerful. Tall, broad-shouldered, calm. His eyes locked onto Dorothy immediately, and Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. She knew his face, not from that night on the highway, not in the darkness beside the wreckage, but now her memory connected the pieces all at once. The news interviews, the magazine covers, the billionaire she had unknowingly saved. The ground beneath her suddenly felt unstable. "Mrs. Callahan," Gerald said gently. His voice carried warmth, but also something heavier. Respect, the kind rarely given by men like him. "I believe," he said carefully, "that I owe you a conversation that should have happened a long time ago." Dorothy tried to speak, but no words came, because sometimes life breaks your heart and restores your faith in humanity within the exact same moment. And the human mind doesn't know how to process both at once. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. "Who are you?" she asked softly. Not suspicious, not intimidated, just direct. Because people who have lived through enough pain eventually learn that the most important questions in life are usually the simplest ones. Gerald turned toward her immediately, and the respect in his expression appeared instinctive. "My name is Gerald Harmon," he said calmly. Then he paused, and somehow that pause carried more weight than the words themselves. "I own Harmon Global Enterprises, and 6 weeks ago, your daughter-in-law saved my life." Eleanor slowly turned toward Dorothy. Dorothy couldn't speak. Her eyes filled suddenly, but not with grief, not even relief. It was something far more overwhelming than that. Shock. The disorienting realization that the small act of kindness she performed alone in the dark, the moment she never posted about, never bragged about, never treated like a transaction, had traveled farther than she could have imagined. But 40 feet above them, behind the rain-streaked upstairs window of the mansion, another person had heard everything. Richard Callahan stood frozen, and all the color had drained from his face. Richard had built his entire career on one ability: reading rooms. He could walk into any meeting, study every expression, calculate every motive, and position himself perfectly before anyone else even understood the game being played. That talent had transformed his tiny startup into a serious corporate force. It had made investors trust him, clients admire him, competitors fear him. And over time, Richard developed the dangerous confidence shared by men who have succeeded too often for too long. He believed he could control any situation. But nothing in his life, no negotiation, no acquisition, no betrayal hidden behind polished smiles, had prepared him for what he was seeing now. Gerald Harmon, standing outside his gate, speaking kindly to the wife he had thrown out less than an hour ago. Richard recognized the name instantly. Not casually, physically, like a soldier recognizing the sound of a weapon before the brain fully processes the danger. Because Gerald Harmon wasn't just the owner of the company offering the $3.5 billion contract. Gerald Harmon was the contract. One signature from that man could change the next 100 years of Richard's bloodline. And Richard had spent 8 exhausting months restructuring his company to impress him. He rewrote proposals, reorganized departments, changed the firm's public image twice. Every decision carefully engineered around one objective: earn Gerald Harmon's approval. And now that same man was standing in the rain outside Richard's home, beside Dorothy. Vanessa appeared behind him at the upstairs window. The moment she looked down, Richard felt her body stiffen beside him. "What the hell?" she whispered. "Yes," Richard answered quietly. "Why is he here?" Richard stared at the street below. "I don't know, but it was a lie." Because underneath the panic now flooding his chest, his instincts were functioning perfectly. And those instincts were screaming something catastrophic. He moved fast, down the staircase, through the hallway, toward the front door, his mind already scrambling to construct an explanation, a recovery plan, a version of reality he could reshape into something manageable. Richard was excellent at reframing things. He reframed emotional neglect into working hard. He reframed betrayal into personal freedom. He reframed abandoning his marriage into necessary change. He even reframed throwing his wife, an elderly mother, into the rain as a transition. Richard Callahan could repackage almost anything. But the second he stepped onto the porch and Gerald Harmon looked at him, Richard understood something with terrifying clarity. There was no version of the situation he could manipulate anymore. Gerald didn't look furious, didn't look hateful. That would have been easier. Instead, Gerald looked at Richard the way people look at doors they have already decided will never open again. Not with emotion, with finality. "Mr. Callahan," Gerald said evenly, his voice carrying through the storm. "I came personally to inform you that Harmon Global Enterprises is officially withdrawing your firm from consideration for the contract." Richard's stomach dropped. "Mr. Harmon, please, if you'll just let me explain." "I'm not here to discuss the contract," Gerald interrupted calmly. "That decision has already been made." The rain fell harder between them. Then Gerald spoke again, slower this time. "I'm here because the woman who saved my life is standing outside her own home in the rain." His eyes shifted briefly toward Dorothy. "And I will not allow that to continue another minute." Silence swallowed the street. Then Gerald turned fully toward Dorothy. "Mrs. Callahan, I have a guest residence at my estate. It's prepared for you and Mrs. Eleanor for as long as you need it." He paused gently. "My attorneys will contact you in the morning regarding your legal interests." Then softer, "But tonight, please come out of the rain." Dorothy looked at him quietly, and she looked back at Richard, at the house she had cared for. Protected, built with years of invisible labor no one ever thanked her for. And unexpectedly, she didn't feel anger anymore. She felt release. The deep emotional release that comes when someone finally sees your value after years of being treated like you had none. She picked up her suitcase. Eleanor was already moving toward the limousine. But then something happened nobody expected. Not Vanessa watching upstairs. Not Doyle standing silently beside the car. Not even Gerald Harmon. Richard stepped off the porch, walked slowly through the rain, opened the gate himself, and stood there beside his wife and mother with absolutely no strategy left. Because in the last 90 seconds, something inside him had cracked open beyond repair. And what came through that crack wasn't calculation. It was shame. Raw, undisguised, and painfully late. Dorothy, just her name. No excuses. No manipulations. No carefully designed speech. Just the voice of a man who had finally run out of angles. Dorothy stopped walking. She turned toward him one last time. The same steady look she gave him earlier in the kitchen. But now there was something different in her eyes. Not rage. Not forgiveness. Something stronger. Peace. The quiet dignity of a woman who suddenly understood she was going to survive this beautifully. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. Then she walked past him. And this time, she never looked back. Gerald opened the limousine door for her. Not like a billionaire showing off wealth. Like a man showing respect. Eleanor entered first. Dorothy followed. The door closed with a soft final sound that felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of a completely different life. The limousine pulled away smoothly through the storm, and Richard Callahan stood alone at the open gate, watching the taillights disappear into the rain. A man who had sacrificed everything meaningful for power, only to discover too late that the most valuable thing connected to his future had been the woman he threw away. Because the most important contract Richard ever had wasn't the $3.5 billion deal. It was the promise he made to the woman who once loved him, and he had already broken it. Inside the warm limousine, Eleanor quietly reached across and held Dorothy's hand. Dorothy stared out at the city lights melting across the rain-covered windows in long golden streaks. The roads ahead looked wide, open, unknown, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of where her life was going next, because the man sitting across from Dorothy that night had not arrived with pity. He had arrived with memory. The memory of cold rain, a dark highway, a stranger's trembling hand refusing to let his slip away, and a voice in the darkness that stayed beside him with a stubborn kind of compassion that expected absolutely nothing in return. That, Gerald Harmon realized, was worth far more than $3.5 billion. This story leaves behind three truths that are impossible to ignore. First, cruelty toward vulnerable people always creates a debt, and life collects that debt at the worst possible moment. Second, kindness offered without expectation is the most powerful investment a person can ever make, because its rewards return in forms money could never buy. And third, perhaps most importantly, the people you underestimate, discard, or force out into the rain are often the exact people silently holding the key to the future you're desperately trying to build. Dorothy never saved Gerald Harmon because she expected a reward. She saved him because someone needed help, that was all. But the universe has a strange way of keeping records no human being can erase. 6 months after the stormy night outside the locked gates, Dorothy Callahan sat beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of a corner office on the 38th floor of Harmon Global Enterprises. Not as a guest, not as someone rescued out of sympathy, but as the newly appointed Director of Community Development, a division Gerald Harmon personally created around one thing: Dorothy's ability to see humanity in people everyone else overlooked. When Gerald first offered her the position, he explained it with the same quiet honesty that defined everything about him. "I've spent 32 years building companies," he told her, "but I've never had anyone on my executive team who understands at a human level that the most important thing you can build is dignity." Then he looked at her carefully. "I'd like to change that." Dorothy did not say yes immediately, and that alone showed how much she had changed. Because for most of her life, Dorothy accepted things too quickly whenever someone needed something from her. She gave, adapted, sacrificed, shrunk herself to fit other people's comfort. That instinct had kept her trapped for years. So this time she paused. She took 3 full days before answering. She spoke with Eleanor. She prayed. She sat quietly with herself for the first time in a long time. And when she finally accepted the position, she did it without guilt, without apology, with the calm confidence of a woman finally learning that taking up space is not selfish. It is necessary. Eleanor Callahan changed too. To everyone's surprise, especially her own, she flourished at Gerald's estate. The property had an enormous garden, and Eleanor admitted one afternoon, almost shyly, that she had always dreamed of having one herself. But life had never stayed stable long enough for roots. So she planted anyway. By the 3rd month, she had unofficially taken control of nearly an acre of the south lawn, and Gerald's entire groundskeeping team quietly accepted that Eleanor was now, somehow, their boss. Nobody argued with her. Eleanor had that effect on people. Meanwhile, Richard Callahan's world collapsed with terrifying speed. Losing the $3.5 billion contract was only the beginning. Within 30 days, 3 major investors abandoned his company. By the 4th month, Callahan and Mercer Development officially filed for restructuring. By month 5, the mansion, the same house with the locked gates and rain-covered windows, was listed for sale. And Vanessa Holt? She disappeared before the for sale sign even went up. The truth was ugly but simple. Vanessa had never truly loved Richard. She loved proximity to power, to status, to luxury. And once those things vanished, so did she. She left quietly on a Tuesday morning, carrying designer luggage and absolutely no regret. Richard didn't stop her, didn't beg, didn't chase her car down the driveway. Because by then, he finally understood something devastating. He had sacrificed everything meaningful in pursuit of success and ended up completely alone anyway. Several months later, Richard sent Dorothy one final message through his attorney because he no longer had the right to contact her directly. 3 sentences. That was all. He said he was sorry. He admitted he had been wrong, and he hoped she was doing well. Dorothy read the message twice. Then she quietly set it aside. She never responded. Not because she hated him, not because she wanted revenge, but because she had learned something important after the rain. Some apologies are not attempts to rebuild bridges. They're simply the sound a door makes when it closes forever. Dorothy wished Richard no suffering, but she no longer allowed him access to her peace. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the difference between compassion and permission became perfectly clear to her. 6 weeks after the night of the storm, Gerald Harmon officially awarded the massive infrastructure contract to a much smaller firm, a company almost nobody expected to win. Why? Because 3 years earlier, the owner had secretly funded a free health clinic in a struggling neighborhood with no press coverage, no publicity campaign, and no financial advantage attached to it. Gerald discovered it anyway. He always did, because character leaves evidence behind, even when nobody is looking for it. But perhaps the most important thing Gerald Harmon did during those 6 months never appeared in any newspaper or business magazine. One quiet afternoon, he returned to the exact stretch of highway where Dorothy found him. The same guardrail, the same dark road, the same place where a stranger decided his life mattered. He stood there silently for a long time while cars rushed past in the distance. Not speaking, not moving, just absorbing the terrifying reality of how close he came to disappearing from the world unnoticed, and how one woman changed that outcome simply because she cared enough to stop. Then Gerald returned to his office, signed a set of legal documents, and officially created the Dorothy Callahan Foundation for Community Dignity. Fully funded, fully endowed, named after her, not because Dorothy asked for recognition, but because Gerald believed the world needed to see what quiet courage actually looked like when it finally had a face attached to it. When Gerald told her about the foundation, Dorothy cried. Not the tears of someone overwhelmed by wealth, or status, or opportunity. They were the tears of a woman who had spent years feeling invisible, and had finally been truly seen. Outside her office windows, the city moved endlessly below her. Traffic lights, ambition, noise, millions of people carrying private heartbreaks nobody else knew about. And somewhere out there, Dorothy knew another person would eventually face the same kind of choice she once faced on that highway. Keep driving, or stop. She hoped they stopped, because she had learned something powerful through all the betrayal, humiliation, and loss. The rain is never the worst part of the storm. The worst part is becoming the kind of person who abandons others inside it. But if you stay kind, if you hold onto your integrity when life gives you every reason not to, if you refuse to let cruelty rewrite who you are, then eventually the storm passes, and what waits on the other side of it becomes something no amount of betrayal can ever take away. That was the lesson Dorothy carried into every day of her new life. Not as a scar, not as bitterness, but as proof that even the darkest night can lead someone exactly where they were always meant to be.